Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Bobby Duran from the Urban Youth Workers Institute, and I am sitting here right now with Dr. Dan Hodge, and we are going to continue this conversation of the soul of hip hop, and as you can see it right here, and the theology behind the soul of hip hop. So Dan, I was looking through some of the chapters and some of the exciting areas that you've been covering, and some of those things are talking about a theology of suffering, a theology of community, a theology of Jesus and hip hop. Now, if you can just take some time to just lead us through what those things were meaning at the time you were thinking of them. What is the theology behind them? Because I know in a hip hop culture, community is very heavily influenced. Because with hip hop, like you were saying, it's not something just music, it's something you live, it's who you are, it's the areas you grew up in, and a community is powerful.
Absolutely.
So explain to us how the soul of hip hop, the theology behind it can relate to each of those chapters that you're talking about, the suffering, the community, and hip hop and Jesus.
Absolutely. Well, really the core of the book is broken down into 5 theologies, and I just wanted to kind of just give everybody kind of an overview of that. When you start thinking about it, I found 5 central theologies, and we'll get to the theology of suffering here in a second. There's the theology of suffering, which you obviously have to deal with, because I think in this world, we live in a world of comfort, and we always want to be comforted. You look at our commercials, the luxury cars, Serta-Sealer mattresses. I mean, everybody wants to we don't want to feel anything. And so it's really hard to identify with suffering, especially if you've never had to deal with that before. So I wanted to kind of really get into that. And what does that look like from a hip hop perspective? Then I looked at community, like you were talking about. It's very important in the hip hop community, because at the end of the day, who do you have? Well, you have your boys, you have your girls. That's who you hanging out with, who you gonna go to. Then I look at Jesus as hip hop, theology of the hip hop Jesus, looking at a multi-ethnic Jesus, a multicultural Jesus. If you just look at the way Matthew breaks down the lineage of Jesus Christ, I mean, it's very much a hodgepodge of people, and that's very representative. I mean, I always make the argument, Jesus was hip hop. He had baby mama drama. He was hated by the police. I mean, he is almost the epitome of what hip hop is really standing for. He was on the outskirts of society. His boy did him in. And so we got to get at that. We got to look at that. Then we look at Tupac's knit grit gospel, theology of social action and justice, and really looking at how does, hip hop really speak to that. Almost a Marxist view of how hip hop almost critiques society institutions, but then also embraces certain elements of that, but contextualizes it. And then the last one is the theology of the profane, which is just looking and finding Jesus in everyday life and looking and finding God in everyday life when your life is a mess. Going back to theology of suffering, I think it's important, particularly as we begin to understand, what does pain look like? And then for some of you guys, it's a little harder to understand what pain is, because maybe you come from a background that's always had justice, that's always had equality. So it's a little harder for people to comprehend that. I know one of the schools I teach at, it's a predominantly upper class school, Christian, and it's hard for students to understand, like, these things have been going on. They were born in a world that things were great, and mom and dad were together, and they had money, and how can I make sense of this? And now you're telling me this world isn't what I thought it was? And so hip hop says, nah, it's not. And let me tell you how the rest of America's been living, where everybody's been celebrating. This is how we've been living. And so hip hop, or hip hoppers, particularly the hip hop community, almost becomes a canary in the mine, if you will, because they begin to reflect what is actually going on in America. David Banner actually says it best. He says, hip hop actually reflects the state of America. America just makes it a lot prettier. All right. And so the suffering is put out there. And so, when Tupac says, I started as a seed, a seam, and started, swimming upstream, planted in the womb. On the top was my pops, my mama crying stop. From a single drop, this is what they got. So he's talking about this pain that he had to go through. And he's like, not to disrespect my peoples, but my papa was a loser. All he had a plan for mamas was to F her and abuse her. And so now we're connecting with the realities of life. The deep and harsh realities that go on, behind closed doors, or maybe not behind closed doors. And how does God come and embrace that? How does God come and love you in that? And what I started finding was like, wow, people really begin to see life in a different way. I mean, they see death in a different way. I think that's what Bone Thugs and Harmony were after, looking what happens to us after we die. Particularly when you've got kids, that I work with who at 16, they're going out and, creating their obituaries. They're going and buying their caskets. I mean, at 16, 15 years old, I mean, what causes somebody to do that? So I wanted to kind of get into that, and where do you find God in this? And so that's where I was kind of coming from with the theology of suffering.
That's very powerful. I think sometimes in our culture and our society, we look, they view hip hop being so negative because of certain languages people use or certain ways of expression. But I think a lot of these artists, some have grown up in a church background, some have not, but I think a lot of these artists share their story. Share their story through music.
There you go.
And a lot of what they share is real, true feelings of growing up. Now, we also know that a lot of what people share is a facade.
Absolutely.
To make money and to seem hard and to seem, hey, this is the way I live life. But we know that most of those guys are in debt and renting cars for video shoots.
Right,
and
exactly.
things like that. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into the theology of hip hop and the culture. How do we help the church?
Yes.
Okay. How do we help the church of America in general communicate that hip hop can be a positive influence within their community and within their youth groups or within their, the people they're in contact with? How do we bridge that from the church and hip hop with Jesus being the sole absolute truth in it? Because we know that you can package something a certain way, but we know that. But if the absolute truth stays the same, then you could package it through hip hop, you could package it through rock and roll, you could package it through folk, blues, grass, whatever you want to do. But how do you help the Church of America understand that if the absolute truth stays the same, how do we communicate Jesus through this theology of hip hop?
Absolutely, that's an excellent question. I think for me, first of all, and it sounds simplistic, but I was having a conversation with a friend one time. And the church at the time was right across from the school. And he was like, oh, man, what we need to do is get some speakers and point it towards that school so they can come over here and bring them over here. And I was just like, OK, that's great. That's a decent start. But what about us going to them? What about us as opposed to them coming this way and crossing that? What if we cross that line and go over? And I would say it's a simplistic step, but it's really taking that step to go further and to say, OK, what is really being said here? What's actually the message? One of the questions I get asked all the time is like, well, Dad, how do you deal with the language of all this? And I was just like, well, what is it that's actually being said? Because if you're saying something that's really deep and profound and you're talking about some things, you use some strong language, I personally just don't have a problem with it. Because I'm looking at it from a particular point of view where it's just like, what is God actually saying and transcending this? If you study scriptures correctly, we see Jesus using some pretty strong language. I mean, he didn't go around dropping F-bombs, but at the end of the day, he used some pretty strong language to make his points. So where I see the church is really coming in is listening. And that's really a hard thing for a lot of people to do because most of the time, and I had to learn this when I got married, most of the time we want to listen to, I want to refute your point. So I'm listening to you, but I'm really not hearing you. I just want to make sure I can counter you on each of your points. And so it's not about that. It's about listening and actually saying, wow, how can I listen with this? How can I really comprehend what is going on here as opposed to critiquing it? And that's really quick, particularly for those of you who have been, Christians a while. It's really easy for folks to just look at things and to criticize things, to look down our noses and to be like, oh, well, those young people. But listen, that's the first big step. And there's plenty of resources online to go out and to figure out where I can download some of these lyrics. The next thing I would say is really beginning to ask good questions. And avoid why. Why connotes hostility. One of the courses I teach is communication, human communication. And it's just like why continually connotes hostility. So you want to stay away from that. What, where, when, how. All those are good questions of asking, what's this message behind here? And so particularly if your parents and you grew up in a different era, you know, where maybe the music didn't necessarily say some of the language that was saying, you know, but when NWA came out with F the Police, I mean, that was our anthem. You know, because at the time we were living in that area where police were brutal and they were brutalizing our community. So when we heard that, it was just like, yeah, that's the way we felt. You know, and at times I still feel that way, not to disrespect any cops, but at the end of the day, what is going on, the music speaking to your existence, I would say asking those questions, listening, and then ultimately engaging. And that's gonna look different for everybody. And that's gonna look different. Maybe you have a kid that's listening to some Nelly and you don't necessarily understand what Nelly is talking about. Well, let's go break down Nelly. Let's go look at what Nelly, and I would agree, there's some stuff in Nelly. I mean, him swiping cars down girls' booties, there's some problems there, absolutely. But if I come at it from a critical point of view, I've already shut down somebody's, you know, because they may like that stuff. I don't want to shut that person down. I want to engage it. Even if I don't completely agree with it, I want to be able to engage it so that we can begin to move on understanding. One of the best things I do with the young people that I work with is I take the music away, I download lyrics and say, let's just read the lyrics. Right. And a lot of these young folks have never heard the lyrics outside of the music. They hear the beat and they think, oh man, this is cool. But then when they read the lyrics, they're like, whoa, this really isn't saying much. This cat's just going over in circles. I'm like, exactly. And now we're into a conversation. Now we're talking and now we're engaging. But if I start out with, oh man, this artist is weak and look what they're talking about. They're talking about sin. I've already created a gap, a barrier between that person.
Right. So you're saying one great way that I've heard before is kind of one, to listen, but two, really to meet people where they're at.
Exactly.
So that way you can have that conversation.
Exactly.
And it's really like not even about, and then at that point it becomes beyond the theology of hip hop. It becomes a factor of meeting people where they're at.
Yes.
So that way they will be engaged to have a conversation that could be something deeper than just the theology of hip hop. You know, so meet them with that. That's good. That's good. I think that's very good for us to hear. So. Man, Dan, thanks so much, man. This is so great to just talk about, you know, going deeper into the theology of hip hop. So we'll be back with our next segment in a few.